If I haven't met you already, my name is Mallory Jackson. I'm the Senior Data and Research Analyst here at Bright Futures. I'm really excited to meet more people and do our monthly data talks here. So we're going to talk a little bit first just about the goals for the data talks, what we're planning to get out of these monthly discussions, what we hope the community gets. Then we're going to share some information about chronic absenteeism, and leave some time at the end to have a 15-minute discussion and take some questions from any of you who have questions. We also have a form at the end to get some feedback about how we're doing on these data talks. This is a work in progress. This being our first one, we want to make sure that it's helpful for the community. So we welcome your feedback at the end. I also want to say, if you have some questions throughout, feel free to write those down. Like if there's something that was confusing, write those down so that we can talk about them at the end. And if anyone's here is not familiar with Bright Futures, I just want to give an overview of our partnership. So we're a cradle to career partnership, and we work with community organizations in Monterey County. And by cradle to career, it means that we work with students and youth who are all the way from in early care and younger children all the way through post-high school completion. So these are the 7 goal areas that we work in. So early care and education, school readiness, language and literacy, critical thinking, youth development and engagement, college and career readiness, and post-high school completion. Okay, so a little bit about the goals for these monthly talks. The first one is to make sure that we're increasing the data sharing with our community. And so trying to make the information as accessible and understandable as possible is one of the key goals of these talks. In addition to that, we want to make sure that we're going in depth with the analyses. So we are doing in-depth analyses and sharing the findings that we think are of interest to the community. And we're going to do this with the Bright Futures data process, which are the 5 A's of data equity. The first being accessibility. So kind of related to the first point there, making sure that we are making the findings as accessible as possible. Accountability, which is how we're taking action to address the systemic inequities that we're seeing in the data. So what action are we doing? And then how do we stay accountable for those actions? The next one is assets. So this is like looking at bright spots in the community. So places where groups of students or schools or school districts are doing exceptionally well. And so what is it that makes those students and those schools do well? Another one is disaggregation. So this is a fancy way of saying breaking down the data by different groups. So rather than looking at the data as a whole, we want to look at data by gender or by race or by income. And this helps us understand the data more than just looking at the overall numbers. The last one is taking a systemic view on the data. So rather than focusing on the student level, so just the student as an individual, we want to make sure we're looking at the system and how the system might be inequitable for students. All right, so I'm going to dive into the chronic absenteeism data. And so if you're unfamiliar with the term chronic absenteeism, it means it's defined by the California Department of Education, and it means that a student is absent for 10% or more of the school days in a year. So another way of thinking about this is that a student missed 1 day every 2 weeks of school if they go to school 5 days a week. So most students in California go to school 180 days per year. So that would mean 18 or more days are missed to be considered chronically absent. So we got to thinking about this because there was an article put out by the Education Trust West, which is an organization in Oakland who does some really good equity analyses. And they had a statement about the new release of data from the California Department of Education, which is released in kind of this dashboard format. And one of the first things they looked at were the chronic absenteeism numbers. Specifically, they looked at students in kindergarten through grade 8. And they saw that for the statewide numbers, The rates increased from 13% in 2020 through 21 up to 30% in the most recent school year last year. They also looked at a few different groups of students. So they looked at low-income students, the rate was 37% compared to the overall 30% total, 34% for English learners, 44% for students who are Pacific Islanders, 43% for African-American students, and also for American Indian students. So much higher rates for these groups of students than the statewide average. So we were interested in this data and we wanted to see if these trends were similar in Monterey County because we're focusing on youth in Monterey County. So I'm going to show you a few different analyses that I looked into. So just to orient you, I have the school or academic years on the x-axis here, so increasing academic year. And then out of 100% of the students who are chronically absent, what percent are chronically absent? So you can see that in earlier years, the rates were around 10% of students who are chronically absent. You'll also see that we don't have any data for the 2019 through 20 school year because of the pandemic. So students didn't do in-person instruction for a good portion of that year. So CDE actually didn't release any of that data. So we don't have data there. I'll also point out that in the 2020 through 21 school year, there were many students who didn't go back to school until the second half of that year in Monterey County. So we're not going to focus so much on the 2020 through 21 data. We're actually going to compare for the rest of this talk, the 2018 through 19 data to the most recent data in 2021 through 22. And so what you'll see is there was a huge increase. The rate is 3 times higher in the most recent data, so all the way up to 29% versus 10% before. And our rates are slightly lower than the statewide average, but very close to that 30%. That is the statewide average. So again, that's a 19 percentage point increase in chronic absenteeism between 2018-19 and the most recent school year that we have data for. So another way of thinking about this is if we have a class of 20 students, it's a pretty typical class size for our county, that would mean that 10% of those students would mean that 2 out of the 20 students were chronically absent during the 18-19 school year. Looking ahead to the most recent data, 29% means that about 6 of those 20 students, so a triple of those students were chronically absent in the most recent school year. Another way we can look at this, rather than looking at the overall numbers, is by race and ethnicity. So again, this is the same data, but now we've put it into a bar graph. So we're looking at the data for all of Monterey County. The rate in 2018 through 19 was about 10%, all the way up to 29% in 2021 through 22. Now we can put on all the different racial and ethnic groups that CDE reports. So you'll see that I've organized it by the highest rates are on the left-hand side here and the lower rates are on the right-hand side. So the highest rates were among students who identify as American Indian or Alaska Native, Pacific Islander, and Hispanic or Latino. So all of those groups were absent at higher rates than the rest of the county. There were lower rates for Asian students, Filipino students, and white students. Something I also want to point out is that in Monterey County, our largest group of students makes up about 80% of all students are Hispanic or Latino. So this is our largest group of students, and it was also the largest increase in chronic absenteeism. So it was I think 21.4% percentage point increase for this group of students. So if we want to focus on that group of students because they make up such a large portion of our students, we can also take this and additionally look at gender on top of race and ethnicity. So here I've plotted just for Hispanic or Latino students, the 3 gender groups that CDE reports. I also want to take a moment to point out that many groups of students, non-binary students make up a very low number of students. And so when there are few students in a group, the data is actually suppressed. So we're not able to see it in the reports that we get. And so that's what this little asterisk means, is that for the data from 2018 and 19, there were actually too few non-binary Hispanic or Latino students for that data to be reported. But there was enough data in the most recent set of data. So I've put it on here just so that you're aware, but for the rest of the talk, we won't have non-binary as a category just because the data was not available to us. But you'll see here that there were similar rates of chronic absenteeism between male and female Hispanic or Latino students. So similar in the year previous to the pandemic as there was in the most recent year. And slightly higher for non-binary students. So just taking that into account, we can look at a few other groups by gender. And so for American Indian or Alaska Native students, the rate for females actually increased much higher than for male students. So this is a 30 percentage point increase, whereas for males, it was only about 14 percentage point. So that's double the increase for female students who are American Indian or Alaska Native. So you might ask, why is that? What was it about that group of students that caused them to be chronically absent? Also for African-American students, we see that actually male African-American students, there was a larger increase and a larger rate of chronic absenteeism for those students in the most recent year. For Pacific Islander students, the increase was about the same between females and males. But we do see that male students who are Pacific Islanders were chronically absent at very high rates. So other groups that we get from CDE are for these different groups. So foster youth, students with disabilities, students who are experiencing homelessness, socioeconomically disadvantaged, which is very similar to students who are low income or qualify for free and reduced lunch, English learners, and students who are migrant education. So these are the groups that are most disadvantaged in our community, and we also see very high rates of chronic absenteeism in both years. So we see even for foster youth, remember that the overall rate in 2018-19 was 10%. So we see that this is 9 percentage points higher, even for the data before the pandemic. And the increase has gone up to more than half of those foster students were chronically absent in Monterey County in the most recent set of data. So something we can also look at are students who are low income. So this is about 76% of the students in Monterey County. So again, because it's such a large group, that's something that we pay attention to when we're looking at the data. So we can add that as a second layer to this data. So we can look at both race, ethnicity, and low income students. So these are the majority of our students. And we see that the rates are exacerbated. So they're even higher than they were before when looking at race ethnicity for all students. So for example, we see that Pacific Islander students, the rate is now 41% when it was a little bit lower before. Yeah. All right, so just to summarize the quantitative data that we have here from CDE, like I said before, chronic absenteeism has tripled in the last few years, so since the start of the pandemic. The highest rates were among students who are Pacific Islander or American Indian or Alaska Native students. For all of those students, the rate was 35% of students. The largest increase from the 2 years that I compared was for Hispanic or Latino students, so our largest group of students. We also saw that American Indian and Alaska Native females were chronically absent at much higher rates than males of that same racial ethnic group. So that was 42% versus a 29% for male students. We also saw that more than half of foster students were chronically absent in the most recent year. And low income students are more likely to be chronically absent than students from families with higher incomes. So we want to look at this with the context of the pandemic, and also with some thoughts from parents in the community. Just because looking at quantitative data only gets us one side of the story, and we want to make sure that we're including the qualitative and the other side of the story as well. So I talked to a few parents in the community. One of them said, and I talked to them recently, so this was about this year of school and not the 2021 through 22 school year, but I think the message remains the same. So they said that my child has had 7 different colds since school started in August and has missed 9 days of school. So acknowledging that there's been a lot of colds, there's been a lot of sickness in the community that caused students to miss school. Another parent said, our children are both considered chronically absent. There were a couple of times when we kept them home when we probably would have sent them to school in the past. And the last one was, depending on the employment and childcare situation, it can be much harder for some parents to keep their kids home compared to others. So just to summarize these thoughts, these were the kind of themes that came up when I talked to parents, that many more students have been sick in the last couple years, and maybe that's because of not being in school from the pandemic, now that they're exposed to a lot more sicknesses. They also feel like they're more inclined to keep their kids home because of the pandemic and this thought that like not getting other people sick. There's some concern about teacher absenteeism in addition to student absenteeism. So one of the parents I talked to said something along the lines of, well, if I know it's going to be a substitute teacher, I don't know if it's worth for my student to go to school, my child to go to school. There's also concern that schools are sending mixed messages about the importance of attendance, but then also saying, please keep your kids home if they're sick. So parents trying to figure out where the line is there. And then also it's been challenging for parents, right? So like from a childcare standpoint, from not having a lot of support for independent study, some parents may not have paid sick leave or employment that allows them to keep their children home from school. So I want to transition a little bit to, what is it that we do at Bright Futures and how can we look at this data and move towards some sort of action and accountability of this data? So often what we do is, we look at localized data. So making sure that we're looking at data from Monterey County. Say you're a teacher somewhere, you would want to look at data from your school or from a group of students that's most important to you. So asking, which students are chronically absent in your community schools? Then we do some talking and listening. So like I did with the parents, what is it that the students and families need to address these issues? So making sure to take the time to actually ask about that. And then moving towards action. So how do we work with the community? How do we work with other folks to improve outcomes and hopefully change systems to make outcomes better for these students? And then all of that circles back. So again, making sure that we're accountable for the actions by then looking at the data and seeing how the data changes. And we have to acknowledge that the data tells us what is a challenge and maybe where it's a challenge, but not how to fix it. So that process of understanding how to fix it is on our shoulders. And hopefully, we can work with other people in the community to make changes. So I want to wrap this all up with the statement from Ed Trust West. This was in the same article that I mentioned before. And I just thought it tied a nice bow around what we've been talking about. So they say, these results are striking, but so are the circumstances from which they came. The COVID-19 virus rendered many Californian students too ill or potentially infectious to attend school, and communities of color were hit the hardest. For large portions of the past 3 years, going to school meant logging onto a computer, yet nearly 6 in 10 parents who earn lower incomes reported concerns about affording internet access. And if students were able to attend school, distance learning often meant isolation, boredom, and stress. Now students need the opposite, engaging, rigorous, culturally relevant instruction, particularly in math. If schools succeed in doing so, we expect to see improvements in attendance rates along with better learning outcomes. So I think this it summarizes it really well, focusing on absenteeism, but also like the learning loss from the pandemic. So thinking about how do we support parents and improve instruction to recover the learning that's been lost in the last couple of years. All right, so I'm happy to wrap it up there and ask for any questions or comments from the audience. I'll check the chat as well. And you can think to yourself about, what are some ways that we as a community can address chronic absenteeism? So I'll pause there. Feel free to come off of mute if you'd like to ask a question. Otherwise, you can put it in the chat.
Hi, this is Sonia with Bright Beginnings, and I just want to open up with a general thank you so much for the way you presented the information, including like the qualitative and the stories from the families in addition to the data. It's super helpful, especially on a Wednesday afternoon to help wrap my brain around the numbers and what it actually looks like in the community. And I think that, that's really seeing numbers helps us see our community differently and what's happening in schools. So just wanted to say thank you for that. And I guess I was surprised to see the number go up that high for chronic absenteeism. And what really was it's this, our general immune system, it's not just because of COVID, but everyone is getting sick more. And I hadn't thought about that at a school level. And then also, I forgot what the also is. Sorry.
That's okay. That's a great point. Yeah. It was something I was thinking about too. It's like, this has been such a hard couple of years. Like, is this the best measure even, the 10%? Like maybe there's something that needs to change in terms of how we qualify students as chronically absent or something like that. Obviously more support for doing some sort of hybrid learning or distance learning if students have to be absent, in addition to, asking parents to keep their students home from school if they're sick. So definitely we don't have the answers, but yeah, happy to talk.
I was thinking, I'm remembering what the thought was, is that it's, so I've heard in my own life, parents who are concerned when a child is sick to keep them home because I don't know enough about how but they as a parent, they'll get called in, your child is absent. There's, things that come up that are in this context irrelevant and might lead to poorer decisions on whether a child stays home or goes to school than better decisions, whatever that means. So how in the moment, how we even define chronic absenteeism and what the consequences are might need to be more flexible.
Yeah, that's a great point. Lori?
Thank you so much. I have so many questions. This was great data. I'm curious to know, as you looked at the numbers, was it representative across all grades, or I'm in early learning, so I'm really interested in how the younger grades compare to some of the older grades. Is it that we have those middle school and high school kids, or is there anything that you can kind of pull out from grades?
Yes, that's a great question. I didn't look specifically at comparing grades to each other. I did notice that the rates were a little bit higher if I left in all grades rather than looking at kindergarten through 8, which is what I did as the final analysis. So I do wonder if there are more students, more high school students who are chronically absent, maybe for other reasons than younger students. So we talked a lot about like, maybe they're sick more because they haven't had this immunity of just regular colds and things like that because of the distance learning. And maybe that's different for high school students. So not entirely sure. I would have to look more at the data. I know that CDE does have a couple different groups that you can look at, so different age groups. I'm not sure that they have a specifically like grade by grade way that you're allowed to look at the chronic absenteeism data, but it's definitely like elementary school and then K through 8 and then all students like that are ways that you can look at the data. So I'm happy to share I think I have it in there somewhere, but I'm happy to share the DataQuest link if you're curious and you would like to look at the data. It's very easy to go in and make a report for our county or for a specific school or district or something like that if you're interested in one place in particular or one grade in particular.
Thank you so much.
David says in the chat, one thing to also consider is during the 21-22 school year, there were state and local policies around quarantines that significantly impacted attendance. If there are two more students in a class who tested positive, the class was shut down in some case, or if a family member traveled out of state, they needed to stay out for a week. Yeah, so all of those concerns about COVID restrictions and things like that, I think affected students as well. So all of these are contributing to this rise in chronic absenteeism. And I think it just reminds us that looking just at the data is not enough. So we have to remember the context in which the data exists, and that there are a lot of asterisks next to the data, but still it's something that we need to keep in mind, is that students are missing a lot of school, which means a lot of learning lost. So how can we work as a community to improve the learning and the outcomes for students in our community? All right. Michael?
Thanks, Valerie. Great job. I'm just curious, we see these disparities, especially for like Native American women, Latinos. I know school funding is typically tied to attendance, and we're often taking like this systemic view. And I wonder if you have any sense, or in any of the qualitative or anything, any comments. And I know there's a lot of data people on this Zoom as well, but how is this exacerbating disparities in school funding? I'd just be curious if we have any information about that.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. Normally I look at the funding through different stream of data, so I don't have it next to the data that I have now. But that's definitely something to keep in mind, is like, does this make it so that schools that are smaller, or there are more students of color in specific schools that are missing a lot of school, does it make it so that they're not getting the state funding that they had before? I think that's a real concern and something that we could look into in the future. Now that we have this data, this analysis done, maybe there's a way to look at school funding for the most current year, because I think it would have to be, like looking at the previous chronic absenteeism and attendance rates for 2021-22. Once we have funding information for 22-23, maybe we'd be able to link those things together in the future. Michael Gutierrez, if you have a question.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. A lot of really wonderful data, and it's making me think about things that we can't control, a person becoming ill, and having the pandemic, but there are things that we can control. And I'm thinking of the report that Luke Wood did with the capital suspensions, and looking at students that are, particularly Black students, that are being suspended throughout their life of their educational journey, and how that impacts their dropout rates. And so, issues of conduct, it's not always suspension, but issues of conduct and how we treat students, especially when you disaggregate the data, especially males of color in particular. Those are behaviors we can't control in the system of how we punish students. And so, I'm just curious if we were to look at the conduct and how the schools react to the students to suspend, and how they're treated, how that impacts the chronic absenteeism. Because I would, if suspending students ultimately over the course of their student journey impacts their dropout rate significantly, the likelihood that it impacts absenteeism, it's likely, right? We don't know for sure, but anyway, so I was just I don't know. I mean, is that something that maybe, or these kinds of things of behaviors that we can't control? Is that something that maybe can become part of the research?
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. I think it's something we should look into anyway. Like, looking at school discipline and suspension and expulsion next to chronic absenteeism. And maybe we look more at chronic absenteeism for high school students, for example, which are not included in this analysis I shared today. One of Bright Future's goal areas for systemic inequities that we look at is school discipline. So that's something that's in the works, and I think I'm happy to share that as a future data talk. Maybe we talk about suspension and expulsion rates and do those sorts of disaggregations that you described. So looking at males of color, and then maybe we attach chronic absenteeism to something like that. So I think that's a great suggestion for a future talk. Thank you. All right. So any last thoughts? If not, I'm going to pull up our calendar for the rest of the year. And so maybe, you know, this is going to change. It's all subject to change. I really like Michael's suggestion at looking at school discipline data. And that could be something that's attached to the October meeting about systemic inequities. So other things that we look at there are like teachers' race and ethnicity next to students, their credentialing and years experience, also school funding. So that relates again to Michael A's question about school funding. So this is all subject to change. If you feel like you have a really great idea or something that you'd like to learn more about, feel free to email me and let me know, or put in the chat if you have something to go right away. I will point out that we're not planning to meet in July or December, since those are less attended months of the year. But we'll keep this kind of, you know, third or fourth Wednesday of the month at this time, if it continues to work for folks. If we get a suggestion about a different time, then we'll plan to meet at another time. So with that, I want to say thank you to all of you for being here during a windy Wednesday afternoon. I hope everyone's staying safe. And I'm going to ask Jeannie to put in the chat a Google form. And this is just some feedback for me and the rest of the team about how we can make these talks more accessible and more understandable and of interest to folks. So if you have thoughts about topics or other thoughts about how we can improve the talks, I'm looking forward to looking at those, and then I'll share the results during the next data talk. So go ahead and grab that Google Doc, write down my email address if you'd like to get in contact with us. These are things that, you know, we work on all the time, and we're really excited to share them with the community. So if you see something here that's, you know, related to the work that you do, or if you're saying, hey, I really would like chronic absenteeism for this group of students or for this school district or something like that, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to give you that data and help you out in that way. So I'll stay on for a few minutes if other people have questions, since we're a little early here, but that's it for today, and we hope to see you next time.